This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast with Living the Wildlife Podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.
Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope you had a great week. As you know, we're starting to publish, I guess, on Saturday, so again, I don't have control over that, but always understand that I do post my podcasts up on Rumble, so if you're looking to check that out, you can check it out at Wildlife Control Consultant. That's my page up on Rumble. So otherwise, you can just simply wait for it to come out here. But if you're looking for back issues, you have a couple places to get it. Get it from the Pest Geek Podcast, or you can go on Rumble and get it there as well. So really hoping you had, again, a great week, just to repeat myself again. So we are getting into the spring season, and so I thought that perhaps we would get out and deal with some issues related to some disease. But before I do that, I do want to make sure that you know how to get a hold of me. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Love to hear from you, comments about the show, suggestions for what you'd like to see, even criticisms of what you don't want to see, and also perhaps interview possibilities. If you have a product or something that you would like to market to the wider community, definitely reach out to me. Glad to do interviews. I do think that we don't do enough of them. I think that there are ideas and concepts and products that still haven't quite gained market traction within the industry, and because we're so small, right? We don't have, a lot of guys don't have the budget to post on maybe Pest Control Technology magazine or Pest Control Pest Management Professional magazine. So you don't have that kind of money. So in that case, perhaps coming onto the show, it doesn't cost you anything, and not looking for money. Would love to get a donation of a product or something. That would be awesome, but it's not required. Love to get information out there. So definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. All right, enough about all that. Let's get on to today's topic. So with the spring coming, I thought we could talk about rabies, particularly bats, of course. Rabies is endemic to bats. Now, it doesn't just occur in bats. It also occurs, of course, in raccoons and skunks and other warm-blooded creatures, as we call them, mammals. Rabies doesn't occur in creatures such as snakes, for instance. At least we're not aware of any. At least I'm not aware of any. If you are, definitely reach out. I would love to hear from you. But it seems at the present time that rabies requires a warm-blooded creature, and bats are certainly one of the primary hosts and victims. They do die of rabies of bats, and so I wanted to sort of introduce you to a publication that is available. I don't call it free. Those of you that have followed the podcast know that I really get kind of irritated when we call government materials free. That is simply a political lie. And that's just all we need to call it. Nothing the government does is free. And I should know, I work for the government. I am not free. I get paid a salary. I am paid by fees and both license fees and registrations fees by companies that work in the state of Montana. That's my day job. But when we think about any government worker, they are paid for by something, and typically it's by some sort of fee-based system or generalized taxes, like corporate taxes or income taxes or sales taxes or something along those lines, property taxes. So I think we need to constantly remember that. So, but the government does things as when they consume some of those monies where they create products that are available at no additional charge. And that's what I like to phrase. It's not free because it's paid for by taxation, but you don't have to pay for it again. And so that's the difference between a government entity and a commercial enterprise, where a commercial enterprise has to generate products that make enough revenue to justify the production, where the government doesn't have to. So we can produce products for a very small readership or for a very small consumer group, if we want to call it that. For example, in my job here in the state of Montana, I can create a class that's only useful for a handful of people. Why? Because my income isn't based on how much I sell. I'm getting paid whether I sell to 5 or whether I sell to 500. Now, when I talk about sell because we have training programs in my day job. So that is what a government worker can do that a private or commercial operation can't. So it's not about bashing commercial and it's not about bashing government. It's just realizing that there are certain advantages and disadvantages with both. And so my bottom line here is that you need to realize that this particular publication is a government document paid for by the taxation of the federal government, and it's available for you as a free download, or maybe I should say no additional cost download, because anything produced by the federal government is public domain. And of course it should be. Why? Because it's paid for by the citizens of, or taxpayers of the United States. And I want to be frank with you, some of the publications that the government makes are simply spectacular. I mean, they are a benefit that I think overrides and exceeds the cost of the production of such a document. And so this is one that I think is like that. Doesn't mean that everything the government does is that great, but certainly I think this publication and others that I will touch on as time goes on were worth the tax funding that was required to produce such a publication. So this is one of them, and let me read it off for you, those of you who are just listening rather than watching. It's called Bat Rabies and Other Lyssavirus Infections. So Bat Rabies and Other Lyssavirus Infections. It's written by Denny, that's D-E-N-N-Y, G. Constantine, just like the Emperor Constantine, edited by David S. Blahert, and it's signified as Circular 1329. That's Circular 1329, produced by the U.S. Department of the Interior, specifically the U.S. Geological Survey, USGS. Now, the USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, you think they normally would do things, mapping in terms of the countryside, giving us those beautiful topographical maps. And yeah, that they do all that. But one of the areas that this particular agency has gotten involved in is also in the area of zoonotic diseases, wildlife diseases, and tracking that. And they do simply some spectacular work. I don't call myself a scientist, so I'm not a peer of one of them. But when I've read or scanned through some of their publications, they are just simply a thing to behold, both for the depth of the information, the detail of the information, but also its readability and usability by the general public. And that, frankly, is not easy to do. All right. The more technical something is, the harder it is to write it in a manner that can be consumed by the public, where you get a high level of expertise being distilled and reduced in language that the general population can understand and appreciate and apply to their lives, or to apply to the understanding of different concepts. And the publications that I've seen produced by the USGS, I I just can't speak highly enough of it. I'm almost at a loss for words here. So why don't we get started with this particular publication? So if you want to download this on your own, you can just simply go online and you want to do a search for bat rabies and other Lyssavirus infections. If that's too hard for you to remember, I would suggest probably bat rabies USGS publication, or you could say bat rabies circular 1329, 1329, circular 1329, and I'm pretty confident it will come up. So why don't we get started here with getting into a little bit of the guts of this particular publication. So I wanted to start with this particular page here, and because they also talk about some of the history and the sociology of bat rabies. Because, you know, rabies in general, not just bat rabies, but rabies in general, it's the oldest known zoonotic disease. And it goes back, let's take a look here at this particular quote. He who shall eat the tongue or the heart of a bat shall flee from water and die. This was written by a man named Rabies, who was a 10th century Persian physician. Now, Persia, of course, is known as modern day Iran. And that was quoted by a publication in the 1599. So think about that for a moment, that this physician realized that if you ate the heart of a bat or the tongue of a bat, you will be afraid of water. Now, those of you who remember the older name for rabies, hydrophobia, fear of water, it's because one of the late symptoms of rabies infection is that you lose the ability to swallow properly, and so therefore you're afraid of water because you're afraid you're going to drown. You're not going to be able to swallow it properly, and it will go into your lungs. And so that's where the hydrophobia. So ye shall flee from water. Well, you only run away from water if you're afraid of it. So it's a very interesting quote that they found. And another quote that they have here, this is from Graham Stoker, 1897, and it says, quote, "What shall I do? What can I do? How can I escape from this dreadful thing of night and gloom and fear?" So a lot of people, of course, have fear of bats. Of course, a lot of this fear can be quite irrational to a large degree, particularly here in terms of North America, primarily the United States and North, of course. But they start this particular book noting some of the cultural and sociological issues here. So I wanted to, so let's get started a little bit more. And notice how it gives us a background of rabies, talks about the history of rabies, and talks about some of a very short history, basically about how, and I'm not meaning history as in the sense it's going to trace it all the way from, the Greeks and that sort of thing, but it's giving us an origin of where this infectious disease can occur in where it was known may have originated, they're saying here, 7,000 to 12,000 years ago is one of the theories. And then it gets into details on the causative agent. So when we think about disease, you have the agent, that is the infectious disease itself. And then, of course, you have the reservoir. The reservoir is the organism that maintains that disease in the environment. And then you have the host. The host is the victim of the infection. So if I get bitten by a bat, I would be the host because I would be killed by rabies. The bat would be a host as well because the bat will die eventually from rabies. But there's also what's known as the vector, and that is how the disease is transmitted from perhaps the reservoir to me. So that's the vector. I like to think of the vector as sort of the bus. How do we get the disease from, how does the causative agent, that is the infection itself, get to me? And that's the vector. The vector is the bus that gets it to me. So we have the vector, we have the reservoir, we have the the disease itself or the causative agent, and then ultimately the host, which is the victim. Now, some of those things can play back and forth, but those 4 key terms are important for you to understand if you're starting to read into understanding disease literature and you're starting to read some of that disease literature. You need to know those 4 definitions, otherwise you might get a little lost. So the author here, Dr. Constantine, I'm assuming he's a PhD, starts talking about where some of the bats that have contracted rabies and how well the prophylaxis for humans. Now, prophylaxis is the rabies shots you can get prior to an exposure. It's sort of a vaccine used to help reduce your need for post-exposure vaccine. So the rabies shots, as we normally we get those after we're exposed, but there are also vaccines that we can get prior to our exposure, and those are called prophylaxis because they're to protect against. So he talks about how some of those in different parts of the world, how those prophylaxis drugs aren't very good at preventing the disease. And then he gets a little bit into the cultural issues, talks about vampires and werewolves and settlement of the Americas. And then he delves down into, this is where it gets a bit geeky for those of you that want to explore this. It talks about how rabies takes on different characteristics, and by that I mean sort of genotypes. It has different changes in its genetic structure depending on how it moves into different species. It's still rabies, but think of rabies as sort of a rainbow where it has different shades depending on what species that it's in, because it has to adapt a little bit to get infectious into those species. Is probably how I would explain it. But you can read this more. This is how one of the ways they're able to tell whether it is a raccoon strain or a skunk strain or a bat strain, and how it manifests itself in different ways. So it's sort of like a family tree. Then he delves into sort of geographical distribution, where do we find rabies in all the various areas. And here we have different, Australia and West Caucasian and Irkut and East European, the number of bat species reported infected in their various continents that they're in. And then he has some nice graphs. And this is where the USGS publications really shine. And that is, they have some wonderful, they're not an infographic per se because they're not that information dense, but they have some beautiful images and illustrations that help provide the information in a very accessible way. And here it shows how many species of bats, bats in this case, that have been found in that particular country. So here in the United States, as of the publication, this was published in 2006, as I understand it, they had 33 bat species that they had evidence of that contracted rabies. So out of, what do we have? Somewhere around, I think, in the 50s, 33 of those bat species have been confirmed to have had rabies, at least one example. And then it talks about other countries and how many bats have been tested positive in those countries. And then he gets out to the world. Of course, if you want to learn more about rabies around the world, it talks about Australia and Africa and Asia and Europe. And so it drills down into those areas as well. And then it talks about how the reporting of rabies has increased generally over time in the United States, starting from where data, I believe, was collected in 1955. I think 1955 was the first year we had a confirmed case of bat transmission of rabies to a human at that particular time. And so notice how that number just kept exploding up to the right with some dips, but it sort of looks like the trend of the stock market in many ways there. So there's some interesting things historically. And then it talks about the percentage of rabies suspect bats identified as rabid in the United States from 1964 to 2006. And so you can kind of see some general trends that are occurring here in terms of how many people have had gotten exposed and the testing and that sort of thing, because typically you're not testing bats unless there's been an exposure. And then it drills down into what species of bats are more susceptible to having rabies compared to other species, and it does this on the basis of what family groups. And interestingly, the family Vesperlinonidae which is insectivores. They're insectivores. 27 of those species have been infected, and the next highest one is Molluscidae, and they're also insectivores, and there's 4 species that have been infected there. The last two are each with 1 each. Mormopidae, they're also insectivores, and the last one is Philostomidae, which is omnivorous, and there's only 1 that's been found infected there. Again, all data is of 2006, but I doubt the numbers are going to change dramatically. They might change in some small areas since that time, but nevertheless, there's still a lot of information here. Now, when getting to areas that may be of more interest to you in terms of our audience, because we're not probably interested in terms of how many species of bats have contracted rabies per se, although that can be useful for your business if you get to the place where you're able to identify bats by species, if you're looking to get that that technical skill for your particular company. And we may need to get there if more bats are going to be put on endangered species list. You may have gotten the news recently, I think it was in the last week or so, where I believe it was the northern long-eared bat that's just been put on the endangered or threatened species list because of white nose. Don't quote me on that, but there was a species that was just recently added. But now we're drilling into how is rabies manifest in a human infection. So let's say you got bit by a rabid animal. How does it exhibit itself in humans? Now, this isn't for the purposes of self-diagnosis, right? We always want to make sure we're not self-diagnosing ourselves. But it's important, the more you understand about a disease, the better it helps you overcome fear, and you become more responsible and sensitive to information and data that's around you, because you have become more attuned to understanding the course of that particular disease. And it talks here in this particular box number 2. Let me kind of blow that up for you for those who are trying to watch online. And it says rabies is characterized by a variable incubation period, usually from 1 to 3 months, but it can range from as short as 10 days to a year or more. And the disease, namely rabies, generally develops in 3 phases: prodromal, excitatory, and paralytic. Now, the prodromal signs last from 2 to 10 days, and they're nonspecific and include a slight fever, malaise, headache, nausea, dilation of the pupils, sore throat, anxiety, irritability, and perhaps sensitivity to wind, bright light, and noise. More significant are abnormal sensations such as pain, burning, cold, itching, or tingling near the site of virus entry, such as a bite. So the prodromal stage is when you get your initial inoculation of the bite or however you contract it. Remember, you can contract rabies in several ways. A bite is certainly one of them, and most common, of course. And for our industry, that would be probably the primary means by which we would be exposed. You're going to get a fever, and you're going to think you might have the flu. All right, and that would start within 2 to 10 days after exposure. Then you move into the excitatory phase, which is present, it says, in 80% of cases, and that may be absent, rapidly transitory, last 1 week, or continue to death. Now, during this phase, victims experience increasing anxiety, apprehension, and melancholy. I mean, you just feel depressed. Muscles around the virus entry site may weaken. Eyes may undergo unusual or uncoordinated movements. Pupils may undergo asymmetric. In other words, one eye may dilate where the other one doesn't. Dilation or constriction. And eye corneas may be insensitive to touch. In other words, you could touch someone's eye and it wouldn't bother them. Facial muscles may weaken and hoarseness may develop. That's where it's starting to affect your throat. Other signs can be alterations in heart rate and intensity, respiratory rate and depth, urinary retention. In other words, you have trouble peeing, followed by overflow of incontinence, and you lose your ability to control your urine, and, of course, constipation. The classical manifestation of rabies in humans is hydrophobia, whereupon attempts to swallow liquid, the victim forcefully expels it due to the involuntary contraction of the muscles involved in swallowing and respiration. So you're trying to swallow, and all of a sudden all your muscles tense up, so you have to spit out because otherwise it's just not going anywhere. The convulsive attack may cause death through choking and failure to breathe. The victim may suddenly die from respiratory arrest, or death may be preceded by coma. Paralysis, which predominates in 20% of cases, may precede death by 1 to 4 weeks. Swallowing is possible, but becomes difficult. A general flaccid paralysis, in other words, you're paralyzed, but you're not stiff. You're still flexible. Apathy progresses to stupor, followed by coma. Peripheral vascular collapse, in other words, you start losing circulation in your extremities, like your legs and arms, and then ultimately death. So those are the 3 phases, of course. You have the prodromal, excitatory, and paralytic phases. But generally speaking, if you contract rabies or you get bitten by a rabid animal and you don't have the treatments, the post-exposure treatments, generally you die. So it's pretty serious, just to be clear about this. Now, you may have heard about the case where someone survived. Now, generally speaking, when we talk about rabies, it's pretty much death. However, there were some cases where people have survived. And here's case 1. This was a 6-year-old boy that was bitten on the left thumb by a rabid big brown bat on October 10th, 1970. Here were his symptoms as this little boy went through. Now, he did get, 4 days later, he got a course of rabies vaccine, but no anti-rabies serum was given. Recovery was complete 6 months after the onset of symptoms. So think about that. So notice what he had. Day 1, he had neck pain, developed 2 days following this vaccine series. 60 days after the victim was bitten by the bat. Day 5, high fever, appetite loss, vomiting, dizziness, but alert and cooperative. Day 11, pain in the head and limbs, became lethargic, writing and walking were difficult. Day 13, he had speech problems, he starts getting worse here. Day 15, he had coma, heart rhythm irregularities and seizures. Day 22, his coma ended and recovery began. So that's quite an event. Most of you have probably heard more about this particular case, which was a 15-year-old girl that was bitten by an unknown bat species in October of 2004 in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. You may have heard about this. And so she basically picked up a bat, and the bat bit her left index finger. Nobody even thought about rabies, of course. Rabies prophylaxis, in other words, the post-exposure shots were not administered. She started developing symptoms 1 month after the exposure. She was discharged from the hospital 80 days following the onset of symptoms. So we're looking at, almost 110 days following her initial exposure, she finally recovered. And this is what happened with her. She got fatigue, day 1 of symptoms, fatigue, tingling, numbness on the left hand about 1 month after being bitten. Day 3 of symptoms, she got unsteadiness, double vision, nausea, vomiting, but no fever. Day 5 of symptoms, remember this was a month after her initial bite, so this would be 35 days after the bite. Fever of 101.8. Slurred speech, involuntary eye movements, tremors of the left arm. Day 6 of symptoms, bat bite revealed, patient transferred to Medical College of Wisconsin with a fever of 100.8. Muscular twitching, incoordination, difficulty speaking, tremors in the left arm, dulled alertness, and hypersalivation. It was just drooling all over the place. Because rabies signs had developed, rabies vaccine and anti-rabies serum were not administered because it's already too late. She gets partial paralysis from days 7 to 34. So now we're at 37 to 64 days after exposure. She has 7 days of coma, sedation medications were discontinued, and the patient became increasingly alert. So they gave her mechanical breathing, heart monitoring and treatment, intracranial hypertension control, that's to control swelling or high blood pressure in her brain. She was given antiviral drugs at this particular time, and she had a drug-induced coma. This all permitted her antibodies to increase. On day 65 post-exposure, day 35 of symptoms, she is removed from isolation and started on a rehab program. Day 80 post-symptoms, this would be day 115 following exposure, she's discharged to her home, and she ultimately recovered and wants to become a wildlife conservation. Loves animals and still loves bats. I mean, that's an amazing story. Unfortunately, we haven't had other instances where this has occurred. So, God bless her. I mean, somehow she was able to survive, but most people haven't. All right, we're moving on. And then the book, I should say, gets into other issues about viral infections reported in other continents. Of course, that's not really our concern here, but those of you that listen outside the United States certainly may be interested in some of this. It talks about where rabies is done, because this book is not just written for the United States, it's written for rabies globally. But of course, there's a tremendous emphasis in the United States because that's where its funding came from. And I would also suspect we have a lot of data here in the United States because we have a lot of rabies here in the United States as well. It talks about how does rabies affect bats. So we talked about how humans are infected by rabies and what our symptomology is. But what happens with bats who are affected by rabies? There's a section on that which is rather interesting, and you may certainly wish to read that. So it talks about the process of what happens there. Gets into examples of humans who have died from bat rabies and how that occurred, as well as some details about how long it took for symptoms to emerge and how long it was to death. Kind of grim, to be sure, but we need as professionals to understand what we're facing when we're dealing with bats. Some of you may be interested, of course, in knowing that are there particular times of the year where rabies exposures or bats with rabies are more common? And the answer is, at least in the United States, yes. Typically, exposures begin to increase dramatically, or incidence of bat rabies tends to increase dramatically in the spring, peaking around September and then dramatically dropping off. So that can be helpful in terms of understanding, maybe teaching your caller service, you may be making sure that your callers know how to handle incidents with bats, and then just be prepared that certain months are going to be higher issue. And you may want to remind your calling staff or your workers that this can be a greater issue, to be sure. If we want to get down into, it talks about how bat rabies affects other species of animals. We talked about how bats are affected by rabies. What about other animals? Well, here's this poor calf, and it talked about how the calf lost the ability to move its hind legs, and so it just, with its front legs, just started digging and scraping the floor. So for those of you in cattle country, that can be important for you to know. If you see a cow acting weird, that cow may have contracted rabies, because understand, any warm-blooded creature can contract rabies, and it's important to understand that. So always treat animals as potential disease vectors, and it's important, and it delves down into other animals as well. When we get onto other sections here, let me scroll down as we're running a bit long here, so let me get out here to this particular section. Of course, domestic cats are a significant problem when it comes to rabies, particularly here in the United States. And of course, that would be a problem elsewhere where you have rabies and free-range cats. Those of you that follow the CDC will certainly find ample evidence of how a lot of people, for some reason, just don't vaccinate their cats and still let them roam outdoors. Cats are also a significant predator of bats, and that needs to be understood. So it's not just bats that are downed, that is, bats that have fallen to the ground, but bats that are actually snatched out of the air. Of course, cats will jump up and snatch them. So it's important to recognize that cats can be a major vector and host of rabies. And of course, the amount of people that they can expose can be very, very dramatic. So I'd like to get down to this last section here. I hope this is the last section. No, I got a little bit more to go. Do bats ever attack people? And do they attack other animals? And the answer is, it's not common. I'm not going to argue it's common, but there is evidence of a bat attacking people. And there's a little section in this publication that explains those bats. And we're not just talking about vampire bats. And so the section on vampire bats, for those of you on the southern section of the United States, or perhaps you're listening in Mexico or some of our Central American areas, you would probably want to take advantage of this information, perhaps use a Google Translator and get into some of this information where you can get it translated for you. But certainly vampire bats are going to be a vector of rabies, but don't forget our insectivore bats that we have here in the United States, though we are getting some vampire bats in the southern border, is my understanding, that some of these bats can attack both animals and humans, and there are certain species listed here, and that information may change over time as we have more observations, to be sure. Now we're getting to sort of the final area I wanted to just sort of get down to this particular section, and that is, it talks about in this appendix, all the bat species that have been reported that have been infected with rabies in the United States from 1953 to 2007, which is a nice little list. And so basically, as a rule of thumb, you just want to treat all potential bats as possible vectors of rabies. I mean, I think that's just the easiest way, because there's a stack of animals here. We already knew that it was 33 at the time, and that number may have increased since then. And here we have another appendix B, bat species reported infected with rabies in the Americas. So now we're going outside of the United States to North and South America. And here you have a list of species as well that have been confirmed contracting rabies. And so this can be useful for those of our wildlife control brethren and sisters that live outside of the United States. So there is some really valuable information here that can be helpful for you, and you may just want to begin to read it just to get a better understanding of bat rabies. Again, let me give the title of this. This is Bat Rabies and Other Lyssavirus Infections, prepared by the USGS National Wildlife Health Center, and it's Circular 1329, and it's written by Dr. Constantine. I'm assuming he's a PhD. And this is a publication that is truly amazing. And I excuse me, I was in error. I said 2006 is when it was published. That's not true. It's actually 2009. So the Constantine, so the citation is Constantine DG 2009, Bat Rabies and Other Lyssavirus Infections, Reston, Virginia, U.S. Geological Survey, Circular 1329, and the document is 68 pages. Well, this is your tax dollars at work. Again, it's not free, but you don't have to pay for it again. Just do a Google search on this particular publication. You can download this publication and learn a little bit more about bat rabies and rabies in general that can make you a more informed wildlife control operator, particularly when you're getting questions asked. But always keep in mind, you are not a medical professional. You do not diagnose unless you are a qualified medical practitioner in your particular area. However, you can become more informed and understand the signs of rabies and how rabies is transmitted and how rabies manifests itself in different species, so that you can become a more qualified wildlife control operator, so that you can help yourself and your clients with this important and dangerous disease. Well, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Do take a few moments to subscribe to our channel. We'd definitely appreciate it. If you want to visit us over at Rumble, you can definitely visit me there. I'm at Wildlife Control Consultant there, and I put my podcast up there as well, where you can listen to it here on the Pest Geek podcast, as I'm part of the Pest Geek podcast family. We'd love to get your input and comments. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. If you have ideas for shows, definitely drop those along as well. And remember, this is Living the Wildlife. Why? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.